Good morning. We're Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. We are on page 415. Tov Tezbov. In understanding Torah, Ner Mitzvah v'Torah, the Torah consists of two levels of Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh, the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah is compared to Yashar. It's a light that shines directly from God, but God gave us the actual written Torah in every letter, all the precision as he. And then Torah Shebal Peh is what elaborates and explains all those verses to turn it into a working document, if you wish. A document that you can use, like he said, to understand all the Pratei HaMitzvahs. Pratei HaDin B'chol Prat HaMidas the Chachma Bina. That's what you have in Torah Shebal Peh and the Vav Sdarim, the 6 orders of Shas, Shisha, Sidre, Mishnah, and Gemara. So he explained that there's basically two aspects in building something. When you're building, the human example of it would be the physical example, is the architectural design, which has all the details in it, but it's all very, very concentrated and just etchings. And then there's another chachma, those that actually can take that and turn that into a working plan that will actually builds the structure. So he said that's the difference in Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. Like the difference in David HaMelech prepared everything b'yad Hashem, his skill. He prepared the ground, and Shlomo was the actual builder. And that's Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. So, in that context, that's why we call the Talmidei Chachamim Binayich, builders of the world, because they're the ones, like he says here, Binayich Boinim Befrat, Bepnimis Bemidas Detera Be'efan HaMaisha shall call Mitzvah Bepratis. They basically build out. They unpack Torah Shebiksav, turning it into a working document that can become a working plan to actually build and create the world. And he says, "V'gam nikra b'ayim binyan shnei magashmi avruchim b'chol prat prat shebehen v'shebchinas hachachma shebechol habrim amahava esem ma'ayin liyesh." Because the chachma of all the creation, which creates them, that's the chachma and dibur that comes into the dibur of Torah Shebal Peh. He's soon going to qualify the issue, because we know Basaram Amoris Nivra Elam, which is God also spoke. We'll soon discuss that. But the dibur of Torah Shebal Peh B'vav Sidrei Mishnah Shemedabrin B'chol Chalkei Datzcham, that discuss in detail all the Chalkei Datzcham. And bottom line is, if you want to know how to implement Torah in an actual way, which builds this world and sustains this world, you need Torah. That's Torah Shebal Peh. Okay. Now it's interesting. I was emphasizing it yesterday. It doesn't say here that they actually build the world. It says that they go through all the details. That Torah Shebiksav is very concise and bekitzer and AdHamtz. Like I said, Torah Shebal Peh, if you learn Torah Shebal Peh, you still have not built the world. You still need to implement those halachas. He doesn't discuss that here. He doesn't even hint to it. But if you look at the precise language, you'll see he's not talking about actual building. In the mashal earlier, he said there's the architectural design, and then there's chachamim, other chachamim acherim, which come and they know the malachas habin, how to exactly structure it. So there, from that you could seemingly derive that he's actually talking about building. But it seems like there's another stage. Even when you have a blueprint, you still need a contractor. You still need builders who know how to translate that blueprint into a real active plan. Then the actual bricklaying or the actual structure itself, which he may not be discussing here, that may be mitzvahs, is another step. But definitely there are 2 steps, even in the context of before you actually do the physical building. I don't know if that's correct, because on the other hand, he does call the Tanoim Amarayim Beinayach. They are the builders. So you could say they're the builders because they have the chachma of knowing how to build. I mean, he doesn't use this example, but it could be like the difference between Moshe and Yeshua. Moshe and Betzalel. So Moshe provided the guidelines and the whole blueprint for the Mishkan, as Hashem told it to him. Betzalel was the actual builder, and there was actual practical difference because Moshe had said that first build the kelim, the vessels, and then the structure. And Betzalel said that's not the way you build. You build the structure, then you build the vessels. So you see there that in the vision part, as we discussed a number of times, Moshe was speaking from the vision. The main thing in the Mishkan is not the structure; it's the vessels, the Aron, the Ark, the Menorah, the Mizbeach, the Shulchan, and so on. But when actual building is the process of actual building, it's a different chach, and they both have value. He doesn't bring that here. I'm just pointing that out, that maybe there you could see somewhat of a difference between, I'm not saying that's Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh, but it's an example. But here clearly he's talking about the two stages, but if you're very precise in the words, he clearly says that concept that I just said, speaks a lot about the details. That's what Torah Shebal Peh really adds, the details with which you can then build the world. Without details, like we spoke earlier, you only have a blueprint, which is an architectural design, but it's still like he puts it, he said, bekitzer or betamtzis. That was the word, kitzer betamtzis. But the pratis comes through the mission, through the Torah Shebal Peh. And now he's also added the concept of the yesh ma'ayin. Now, I think we'll see it soon. Keep in mind, there's two things. There's the actual first time that was built the world, as we discussed. Of course, God was the one that built the world in the 6 days of creation. But then there's the sustaining of the world, which is really what Torah does. We know that Torah sustains the world. Bereishis b'shvil Yisrael, b'shvil HaTorah. We learn brisi, imle brisi. If the Jewish people did not receive the Torah, the world would have ceased to be. So this God gave the power to those that learn Torah and keep Torah to keep the world alive, so to speak, and sustain the world. So he's not necessarily talking about here about creation the first time. The creation, yesh ma'ayin bereishis bara elokim. It doesn't say that Tanoim and Amoraim created the world. That's what was his initial question. How could you call them builders when they able to build the world with Torah Shebiksav? But now that we understand the way the whole structure works, at first there's the general blueprint, as we learned, and then there's the breakdown of the details. That's where they come into play. The banayich beinei elam. Okay, yes. So we're up to now the 6th line, the top of page 415. I'll continue reading from there. And all this is coming to explain Torah that the Torah the Atzmi, that retains its pre-tzimtzum integrity, travels into the world of Ishtalshus, into creation, and brings that But in that itself, now we've learned there's two levels, the level of Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh, which of course is necessary because Torah Shebiksav in a way reflects more the godly vision, the divine vision. Torah Shebal Peh reflects the actual creation of the world, meaning the details and all the specifics to make a world like ours. But both of them are driven by Torah. So it's all about how Torah, like he said earlier, that Torah Shebal Peh creates the birur of how. How do you turn this world into a dira b'tachtenim? How do you turn every physical fiber of existence from daimim, tzemeach, chayim, medaber into a keli telekus? Those are the words he used earlier. And that's where Torah Shebal Peh comes into play. And that's why they're called beinei elam, because they're the ones that can help do that. Torah Shebiksav alone, we would not know how to take anything in this world, whether it's the parchment for tefillin, or matzah, or the daled minim, or whatever it may be, or tzemer for tzitzis. We would not know how to actually turn that into a mitzvah that's an actionable mitzvah that knows that fulfills and makes that physical object into a keli, into a vessel, a channel, like a conduit for godliness. So it's Torah Shebal Peh that does that. So continuing this discussion, he's still in the middle of it. We're on line 6, on page 415, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. He says like this, parentheses. The Pirish, Maimer Dibru Chachamim Beheva. So there's Maimer Chazal, Dibru Chachamim Beheva. Let's see, down below, do they zeichen it? Yeah, in Shabbos, in the Mishnah. Dibru Chachamim Beheva literally means that our sages spoke in the present. They didn't speak about the past. It's relevant to a lot of halachas. that they spoke about the present situation. So there's a deeper meaning in Chassidus. What does Dibra Chacham Boheva mean? What does it mean they speak in the present? So he said, B'mokem Macher, it's explained, and they also, down below, they cite where? Bitler Rebbe's Maimer and elsewhere. And explain Dibra Chachamim, Divrei Chachamim, who Sibos Mokesh shall call his Savas Anivrayim. That Dibra Chacham Boheva means something even more than just they're speaking about the present. They're actually creating the present. That the words of the Chachamim is the Sibba, the cause, and the Mokkah, and the source for all creation. Hisavas, Heva. Heva comes also from the word creating. Dibra Kosa Beheva. Metam Hanal, for the reason that we spoke earlier. Because what do, the Chachamim? The Chachamim take the Torah from the blueprint and they implement it. So it's not just they implement technically, but with that they really build the world. Because without that, you would have it all in a very obviously in a divine high atzmi level of Torah Shebiksav, but you would not have it as a working document, as a workable and implementable, I don't know if that's a word, but actually an actionable document, Torah, that gives us the details and everything necessary to build the world. So it says that's when it's Dibra Chachamim Behavior. Shemedivre Chacham, let's read it again from the words of the sages, Sibas U'Moker Shekol Isavas HaNivrayim, of all the creation of the Nivrayim. And let's make this clear. He's not saying that the Chachamim take over, God forbid, what he says in Shai Yuchad V'Amunah, HaMachadish B'Tuve B'Chol Yom Tom in AdHamtz Bereishis. So we know that the Dvar Hashem, he says, is Dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, right? That the words of God create and sustain existence every second. And we clearly say every day that God sustains existence every second, and if for one moment he would cease to speak, the whole world would cease to be. That's clearly. And it doesn't say anywhere there that it's dependent on the Chazal, on the Chachamim. So we're not talking about actual pure creation. We're talking about the sustaining, the sustenance of the world, the purpose of the world. Because remember, the world wasn't just created just to exist. It was created to fulfill God's will. And what is God's will? And everything in creation, in order that Torah teaches us how to make the world dira b'taktenim. That's the real purpose. If we didn't have that, of course God could create a world and just create a world and let it sit there. But that's not the goal. That's my explanation how to reconcile these two aspects. Additionally, it does say in some places, of course, that we're a shutav l'HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'ma'aseh bereishis. We're partners. Now, what does that mean? Based on the Maimer Chazal I mentioned before, that if we did not keep Torah, the world would cease to be, you could say very simply, yes, God sustains the world every second with his energy, but he would stop doing so. He wouldn't want to do so if there was no one fulfilling the kavanah of keeping Torah mitzvahs. Now, obviously, that means there's always going to be someone in this world that keeps Torah mitzvahs, because you see, the world never stops, and that's the case. But in a sense, he's created partners to do that. So he's not talking so much about the dynamics of pure creation. He's talking about builders that keep that. Like, in other words, God gave us the guidelines, but who actually implements the building of this world that should be aligned to the way God wants it to be? That's the Chachamim. Dibra Chachamim behavior. But Afal Pi. Here's a parenthesis within a parenthesis. She'omer b'Zeyar. And even though it says in Zeyar, the Yud HaDibris, that the 10 Commandments, Anoich Hashem Lekach, Sheirish Liyud Mamoris, that the 10 Commandments, which Hashem said, Anoich Hashem Lekach, Ashal Tzisicha, Layilacha, and so on, is the root of the 10 statements that God used to create existence. So what's the Alpha P? What's he asking? What's the question here? What's the qualification? Because seemingly, one second, Asar Mamor also God said. Asar Sadibris also God said. So what is he saying here? Is Asar Sadibris sounds to me more like that's what Hashem wants us to do in this world. That's like the mitzvahs. That's like the Torah of the world. Asar Mamor is the creation of the world. So I'm not sure what he's qualifying. Let's see how he responds, how he explains it. Maybe we can figure out what he's trying to qualify here. So he says like this. So he says, "Afapi that the Zohar says that the Yud Dibris is the source, the root for the Yud Mamoris." Okay, let me just see. Nisman le'il amet tazayin. Down below, they tell us to look at page 16. Let me just see something there, if there's anything. There he says exactly what I just said here. That the 10 commandments are the root of the 10 statements in the creation, is because because God made a condition that the only reason the world will stand is when the Eden receive the Torah. So he clearly brings that. That's all dependent on the Torah. What I've been explaining here, that we're talking about. He says that several places here. I'm back on page. This is a different mimer, page 16 in this same volume. That's what he says. That the whole purpose of creation is because of Torah. Okay, let's see how he explains it here, and we'll try to figure it out. So he says, okay. So Afal Pishama Bezer the Yud Dibris Sherish Yud Mamoris. So what's the Afal Pi? That seems to make a lot of sense. Oh, I know what the Afal Pi is. Okay, here's what I think it is. He just said that's the Chachamim in Torah Shebal Peh that sustain the world because they implement, so to speak, Torah into details. And Torah Shebiksav is still a concise, very brief, like the blueprint part. But we know the Zohar says that the 10 commandments, which is Torah Shebiksav, is the root of the Asiyah Mamoris. So that would seem to indicate that even before the Chachamim, before Torah Shebal Peh, the very 10 commandments in Torah Shebiksav is already the root of creation. That's what I think he's trying to qualify here. Yeah. So he says, Gam ze emes. This is also true. And I think he's taking us back to what he said in the beginning. If you remember, when he began the answer at the bottom of page 413, he said, Shnei emes. Both are true. The Vadai Tchilas Hadotz, I'm reading from the bottom of page 413. I'm going to go back here because it seems to be exactly the same language. He says, this is certain that who created the world initially from the outset? God looked into the Torah Kadesh, his own Torah, the written Torah, and we're talking now before Torah Shebal Peh, Shenikra Umna, and this is the Sheresh HaBinyan. Says that clearly the Asiyah Sheba is the root of the Binyan. That's certain. That's how the whole creation began. In other words, it didn't just begin, God said, I'm creating a world. He created a world based on what's written in the written Torah. So he's saying here also now, going back to where we are now, Gamze Emes. This is also true, that the Yud Mamoris, the 10 statements that create the existence, comes from the 10 commandments, which is the written Torah. That's how it was initially. In the beginning, before there was anything, only the Eibishter. So what did he do? He essentially documented, if you wish, a blueprint called Torah. And according to that Torah, in the beginning of God's desire and the wisdom of Ma'aseh Bereishis, of creation, it was followed what says in the written Torah. But however, so here he says it clearly, explicitly. But the kiyum, the sustenance of this building, that's like putting it in place initially. That's how Hashem put the world in place. But the kiyum ha'elamus, which is called binyan, this is what he's called binyan here. No, it's binyan here. He does not mean the first time it was established. He's talking about that ongoing, consistent is the Talmid Chachamim Eiskim B'Teira, that they are Eisik and Teira Shebal Peh, and they are continuously drawing from the written Teira and explaining it in detail and bring it into an actionable plan that creates. So you have to say, even though he doesn't say this explicitly, because remember, Torah Sheba'al Peh was also given by Hashem. Torah b'pirusha nitna. So it would seem to make a lot of sense to say, one second, why doesn't he just say, because the Eibishter created the world with Torah Shebiksav, but also Torah Sheba'al Peh, before the Chachamim came. Doesn't say that. Because obviously, at that point, probably Torah Sheba'al Peh was part of Torah Shebiksav. The Eibishter knows what the interpretation would be. But he wanted us, the human beings, the Talmidei Chachamim, to extract it from Torah Shebiksav. So you'd say that in the beginning of creation, he used Torah Shebiksav, the Asaras HaDibros. The Asaras HaDibros is the root of the Asar Ma'amaris. But the Kiyum now comes through the Talmidei Chacham who are bringing it into detail. They are drawing out from Torah Shebiksav into Torah Sheba'al Peh and continuously sustaining existence. That's how you'd have to explain it. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense because that Torah Sheba'al Peh was all Mamayla Lamata. The way the Eibishter looks, when the Eibishter sees a pasuk, from his point of view, he sees all the interpretations that would later be said in Torah Sheba'al Peh. However, he wants us to draw it out through our effort and so on. But the Eibishter sees it, that's more from above. That's not working it out as the way it's supposed to be done properly in Torah and establishing a halacha. I'm just adding some explanation just to fill in some of the gaps to make sense of this. Okay. So that's the parentheses in the parentheses. The Tamanal. That's called Dibur Chacham Behavior Simon Makid. Okay. Are there any, I'll stop here if there are any questions. Is there anybody has questions? Okay. But here again, you see the Mittler Rebbe in his classic style is it's a flow of consciousness, as I call it. Can be a little overwhelming because it seemingly this should have all been clarified a little earlier. And now, once he's made the statements, he's now starting to add more material. And you go back and say, 1 second, let me make sense of it all. So we have to go slowly, but he's definitely doing that. And you'll see he's now going to go back to ideas he spoke about earlier, about that the ultimate purpose of the whole Torah is to come down to this world and transform this world and make it a home for God, a dir b'tachtenim. So in Torah Shebiksav alone, which comes from the Atzmi, from above, that's not fulfilled until you go into Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is why Torah Sheba'al Peh, he said, reaches deeper than Torah Shebiksav, because it reaches back into the very core source of what God intended in the first place. Like he said, if you remember, not safe from the beginning is where safe ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, that where is fulfilled the purpose of the whole of Torah and the highest levels is dafka when it comes down to details down here below in Torah Sheba'al Peh. He said that earlier on page 412, and even earlier, I believe. Yeah. We spoke about how Torah Sheba'al Peh has a maila, the Birur, after the Birur, Elo Lamaila Mishema of Torah Shebiksav. I'm looking at page 411 now, 411, 412. Because the Chol Ikir Arotzim Kavona is that we should come down below, that the Chachma should define this world, should create this world. Basically, the transformation of darkness to light, which is dafka through Torah Sheba'al Peh. So he's now taking us back to that. Bear in mind, officially, we're still in the middle of a parentheses. If I recall correctly, it goes till, it goes a few good 3 more lines. So he goes on now, continues like this. So he says, Lefi, now, why is this the case that we're emphasizing the power of the Chacham and Talmidei Chacham, that they are the builders? Because the goal is not the goal is that it shouldn't remain as a blueprint. The goal is that it should actually build this world and sustain this world. The beginning is wedged in the end. Dafke. Mishum the safe maisa, because the end of the process, safe maisa, the end of the process means the end of the building, the binyan ha'elamis, in the building, in the building of the worlds, the inner intention of it all. If you're talking about the actual building, so there are stages, the beginning of the building, the next stage, the next stage, the next stage. But if you want to know what is the inner intention of the architect in the first place, why did Hashem create the whole world? The Pnimis HaMachuven was not just to build. Shebezeh, in this, Shehu lahafich cheshech le'er. The purpose was not just to build the world, but to transform the darkness of this world to light. Al yidei ha-birur ha'achrin, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Through the final last birur of Torah Sheba'al Peh. What does he mean by birur ha'achrin? Not the birur rishon, not the earlier clarifications of Torah Shebiksav. Torah Shebiksav is also a birur. But if you remember, that was a birur of the cheshech ha'elyon, of the chashmal ha'elyon, of the tzimtzum, that it pierces the tzimtzum, and even after the tzimtzum, we know what God wants in Torah. But that's still not transforming the darkness of this world. So what does that? Birur ha'achrin. Only Torah Sheba'al Peh does that. Because Torah Sheba'al Peh gets involved in the arguments of right and wrong, and kosher and not kosher, and tameh and toher, and kosher and posel, pure and impure, and all that. And it requires the immersion and the exertion of the scholars, of the Talmid Chachamim, those learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, to draw out going through all the details and all the specifics to figure out what is kosher, what is not kosher. If someone comes and shows you a matzah, Pesach is coming. Is this matzah kosher lePesach? How would you know? You look in Torah Shebiksav, it just tells you should have matzah, should be shmatim l'chab, should be shmura matzah, meaning matzah that carefully that was not affected by water, did not rise. But if someone said the details of that, you have to go on to learn this halachas, the halachas in Torah Sheba'al Peh, and today not just Torah Sheba'al Peh, the commentaries on Torah Sheba'al Peh, or that it's also part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and go through all the nuances as a good Rav would do, until you come away and say, okay, this matzah could be used, it can be used. If you only went with Torah Shebiksav, you just know you need to have kosher matzah. So practically speaking, Seif Ma'aseh Machshav, the kavanah is fulfilled only through the birur achrin of Torah Sheba'al Peh, when you get that clarity. Dafke. B'chol prat b'prat, in every detail and detail, sheniskarim b'halachas the vav sidrei mishnah, that are mentioned in the laws of the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which is all obviously the basis of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Shehu eila be'er chezer lamayla me'er yosher dechachmei la the Torah Shebiksav. And because Seif Ma'aseh Machshav Tchilas, Nos Tchilasim B'Seifon, that's the bottom line point. The point is that there should be a Torah down below that can clarify these matters. And that eila, as Torah Sheba'al Peh does, is eila with the er chezer, the refractive light that comes now from the bottom up. This is not coming from the top down, because the top down is telling us what the written Torah tells us what to do. Here, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, that clarity is being achieved through the Rabbanim, through the Chachamim. That's Eila L'mayla, higher than the Er Yashar, than that original direct light of the Chachmei law, of the supernal Chachma, the higher Chachma of the written Torah. That was there in the beginning of Ishtalshus. Remember, it all began with Torah Shebiksav communicating to us, transmitting the Er, L'mayla Lamata. But then the goal is that it should come down below, and in Torah Sheba'al Peh we should clarify and go through the whole process of separating and clarifying and refining and transforming the darkness into light, that in a dark world, we know what Hashem wants, and we create from this world a kelim, containers, channels of godliness, and that is even higher than the Er Yashar of the Torah Shebiksav. That was B'tchilas Ishtalshus. I'll just read 2 more lines and I'll stop for questions. Ukedugme, sha'amar vayares kol asher asa. So he's bringing an example. We see in the creation process, we see the Eibishter created, and then it says he looked and saw everything he did was teiv, or teiv me'id. What does this verse add? God needed to look and look. It's like, after you finish a building, you build something, you look at your handiwork, and you're very proud of it. What is this coming to add? So he's saying it briefly here, but another Maimorim, it explains it. What was Hashem adding? Because he's looking at Seif Ma'aser Machshavat Chili. He's looking at the end product and saying, yeah, it's the way I wanted it. In other words, during the process of creation itself, you're in the middle of creating, you're building. But then when you're finished, you say, Vayad, Eskola Shadasa. He looked at everything, what he did, and yes, it fulfills his desire. Not that there's a suffix, God forbid, a doubt that God didn't fulfill it, but the Torah is telling us because Seif Ma'aser, because he wants the purpose is the end process. And if you don't have the end process, you can't really say Vayad Eskola Shadasa. So that's like the element that comes from the Ur Cheza. After you finish, you look at it and say, the full dimensional, final touches is fulfilling my Pnimiyas HaMachuven, like he said, my inner kavanah in the whole thing. So like when you come and you see a building being built, as long as it's in the middle of building, you can't say that yet. When you come to the end and the building is finished, the day it's finished, you come and say, You see it also in the Mishkan. When the Mishkan was finished, when they built the sanctuary, the day it was finished was a whole other level. And all that happened the day that was finished, because now it's not just that they built it. You have the conclusion, you have the whole thing is ready to go, so to speak. You have the finished product. Okay. Al-Kain. And therefore, Birur Zeh, in this Birur of Torah Sheba'al Peh, this Birur Achnen, Omar L'chveidi Barasav. You remember he brought that earlier, that for my honor, Barasav, I created. Yetzartiv. And then it says, V'afasisiv, that for my honor. But what the B'chin is covered, the L'kvedi, the Lamed Beis Nesivas Chochmeh, the Malchus, the Torah Sheba'al Peh Dafke. That this Kvedi is being fulfilled, Dafke through the covered, which is the Gematria 32, the 32 paths of Chochmeh, of Malchus, of Torah Sheba'al Peh, because remember Malchus, Torah Sheba'al Peh is Malchus, not Chochmeh law of Atzilus, but the end process in Malchus of Torah Sheba'al Peh, Masnis in Malchus, so like he said, the Mishnah Malchus, Dafke there, the L'chvedi is fulfilled as it comes down below. He said this earlier, I believe it was on top of, yes, it was on top of page 411, but then later he explained it more, I recall. And the Alter Rebbe also, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, he brought that point. I think it was the next page. Okay, and with that he concludes this the parentheses. So this whole parentheses began with yeah, it looks like that's the end of it. Okay, let me stop for any questions.
Rabbi Jacobson, it seems like there's like this parallel concepts here, and correct me if I'm wrong. We spent the whole time when we were talking about in Ayin Beis, the whole concept of Ein Od was the person who hit rock bottom, and through that was able to reach a much higher level of the Olam Atzmi. But it seems to me that it's saying that for somebody who's not in that path and is in the path of Torah mitzvot, by doing the birur in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and let's say smarting Gemara and Mishnah, is able to also achieve the same level. In other words, you don't have to break, and because the name Kavodi was also used for Moshe Rabbeinu when he was placed in between the two, between the rocks, right, to be able to see Hashem's glory. So the point is, at least one of the points to me seems to be that it's a parallel, a track. One line is, yes, you could reach the Olam HaAtzmi by being Ein Od and being the rock bottom and really go from the depths of the heart, from the darkness. But the other way, for a Torah scholar, was somebody who he can achieve it by doing the birur in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Fair statement?
Not exactly. The way I would phrase it would be like this. God created the world, and he put Adam and Eve and the human being on earth and said, you fulfill my will. And in this physical world, turn it into a home for the divine. In other words, take Garden of Eden and make it blossom and grow through the Avda L'Shamra, through serving Torah mitzvahs, Mitzvah sesa, mitzvah sesa, all the mitzvahs. It's called Birurim. That's the work of Birurim, to take a physical material world and turn it into a divine home. That's what we're talking about right here now. And that Torah Sheba'al Peh plays a tremendous role in that process. Obviously, in later generations, it develops into a whole fuller experience. Then there's another issue called transgressions. If a person sins, like the Chet Tzadas, and they have not just, they're not fulfilling what God wants, they have defied God's will. They have corrupted the world. What happens then? So that's a whole other level, what we call tshuva. When you're talking about hitting rock bottom, the ein we spoke about, is we're talking now already going into a darkness that is a darkness of distress, if you recall. It was the distress that comes from Matal Lamayla. So yes, it has something in common, but even tzaddikim have birurim. It's only the Baal Tshuva that has the second thing. We learned also that tzaddikim, when Mashiach comes, will also do tshuva, will also have that quality. So maybe that's what you meant, but I'm just phrasing it in this way. So in other words, there's no question the goal is to transform darkness into light. But darkness can just be a world where you don't see godliness, and you, through Torah Sheba'al Peh, you clarify what's right and what's wrong. Then there's lower levels where you actually, like you called it, we talked about hitting rock bottom. That's already getting to a point of such distress that the darkness itself propels you to wholly new places. So what he's talking here is in general terms. He's not necessarily talking about rock bottom. He's talking in general that the Torah was given down to this earth and is transforming the darkness of this world into light. That's the kavanah. Is there another level of going and actually the darkness itself, like he spoke, the gvuras themselves get sweetened in their root? Not just that they are sweetened by the chsadim, and not just that they are kalim to the chesed, but they themselves become transformed like zdeinis, that the transgressions become zachias, merits. That's the deeper level that we talked about in Ayin Beis. And I will discuss it later once we finish with this whole with the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer and go back to the Ayin Beis themes. We'll discuss it. But that was a lot more in the Mamata Lamaila that he spoke from Tefillah before he got to Torah. Now we're talking about the Mamata Lamaila within Torah. In Torah that the comes and transforms the darkness. Now, does that ultimately give power also to do tshuva and even transform the lowest levels? Yes, but I just wanted to distinguish the two things. So that's what you're touching upon. So as I said, I may be saying what you said, I just phrasing it in a more, at least in my mind, a more organized way.
Thank you.
Clear what I said? Do you understand what I was saying?
100%. No, we're saying the same thing. It's just, I guess yours is much more.
Okay, good. No, so good, fine.
I have a question about the raya he gave, quoting Yeshayahu, Lichvodi Barasav, and I mean, I looked it up. I posted the pasuk. It's Mem Gimel, Yeshayahu Mem Gimel pasuk Zion. Anyways, it says Kol Anikra Bishmi Lichvodi Barasav Yitzarta not Apasisa. All who are linked to my name, whom I have created, formed, and made for my glory. And I must be, the reason I'm asking about this verse is I must be missing something in the explanation, because I'm sure it's a good proof. I just don't see how. So that must mean I'm not understanding the point here.
I don't know if I would call it a proof. I think it's just an interpretation of the verse. So I don't know if it's a proof, but regardless, you have to go back a few pages, and I'll share with you exactly where. Firstly, the top of page 411. Page 411, and then let me just quickly scan the pages where he spells it out in detail, because he's referring to something he said earlier. It's not a new theme.
Something about
and then there's the Alter Rebbe's mind. 1 second, just a second. Give me a moment here. Mm.
Something about the Lamed Gimel, the Lamed Beis.
Lamed Beis.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Lamed
yeah,
Beis,
yeah.
Nesivos Chachma.
If you remember a few days ago, remember when I read the Malta Rebbe's Maimer in Torah, we read it together.
Yeah, was it in there?
So there he brought it in more detail. And I actually even explained why the Mittler Rebbe was bringing it, because, okay, so I don't see it right now in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, except on top of page, as I said, page 411. Let's see, something like
Shin, Tzadi Ches, whatever that, 98, 398. He says about this 11 lines down. The line that begins, it starts about Fakta be.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. Is that what you're referring to?
Not really, even though probably relevant as well, but it's fine. Let me just see. So let's in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer.
Oh, he also says it's explained above. Nesaman La'il, it says page Samach, what is that, 60?
Yeah. Okay.
We don't have that, do we, here in this printout?
Yeah.
Must be something.
If you have the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, that's where he says it explicitly on page 38D. So he says that the kavanah is to bring the Torah all the way down below and create a bittul below, just as it is above. So he says, "K'moshe kosav l'kfedi barasav, kovid b'gemati lamed beis, hem lamed beis nesivas chachma, barasiv b'chinas Talmud, yitzarta b'chinas Mishnah, vasisi b'chinas Mikra." That everything was created b'chinas chachma and Erein Sof, and the ultimate kavanah is to come down and bring down that the l'chvedi of Torah is manifest down below. That's where this originates from the Maimer, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. If you look there, you'll
No, I'm looking at it right now. Now I understand. Yeah. It's a very short allusion.
It's short and brief. That's why, I believe I explained it when we learned it the first time. I'm just looking if he says it again. I don't think so. Okay. Yeah. Well, the point is, Ulechvedi usually refers to Atzilus. Then Barasav Yitzativ Afasisiv, he's saying it very briefly, but essentially he's basically saying that this Birur is coming through the covet of the Lamed Beis Chachma of Malchus in the lowest levels. Doesn't say here Asiyah, but he means also the lowest levels of Asiyah. I think the next section, he's actually going to say it more specifically as we read on. After the parentheses, that's why the parentheses, I'm wondering whether they're accurately placed, because the next section, I'm ready to read on. Any other questions anybody has? Because I think we have to read further to understand this better. So he says like this now. He's quoting what he brought earlier, if you remember.
Can I ask one quick follow-up?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, and sort of the that pasuk with Kvodi Barasa, etc. And I'm trying to understand it as it relates to the word kavod. Can one say? I mean, in addition to what each of the different levels of Torah that constitutes the creation, that the connection of kavod to honor is that through the implementation of Torah, that is what constitutes kavod Hashem. In other words, if a human wants to understand,
you could say that.
Okay.
I think that's what it actually means.
And thereby you're fulfilling the will of God by carrying out the Torah, and that's what gives them nachas. That's how you honor God. You do what He says, and that you fulfill the purpose of creation by fulfilling Torah, and that's what He wants. He wants to make tzediyah b'tachtonim. You do that with the birur of observing Torah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he says that when you go back to page 411, you'll see the new paragraph. He says like this: "Hine kol zeh ubchinas chochmei lo teshuv shanikra covered the alien, ubchinas era alien nahiri law v'zeu kol hanikra b'shmi mamish l'chvedi b'rosh zeu nikra teres adam shu biyah." Nikra b'shmi zeu shnikra teres adam shu biyah. But omna madrega beis ubchinas. Yeah, and then he says that Dafka Teresh Peh is called Malchus, and it's Malchus where the covet ultimately is implemented. Correct.
Okay, good.
Yes. Yeah. That and that's where he says, if you look, that's why Eshes Chayil. That's why it goes up even higher. Teresh Peh v'gam also b'tzchon the Talmud b'Brio Mishnah b'Yitzira Mikra b'Asiyah Mishnah b'Asiyah b'Sifakol. Okay.
He's saying Kesser is manifested by the observance of Torah Shabbat Peh because Malchus is sourced in Kesser, I think, or you said it's sourced higher than even the Chochmah. Ultimately, isn't that correct?
Yeah. Yes, correct. Yeah, because the Birur goes all the way back. He says to the source even higher than Chachmei Lov Teresh B'Ksav. It goes back to the Eibush himself because God. The whole reason he gave Teresh B'Ksav is that it should come down below and transform this world. So Teresh Peh does that. So that's why it goes back to essentially to the programmer higher than even than the source code. Put it that way. Yeah. So now let's go back here. Now he says like this. So this he brought earlier as well. And this was a big section of Ayin Beis. What does it say? The Talmud B'Briya, Mishnah B'Yitzira, Mikra B'Asiyah. Now here, you could say, 1 second, it seems to reverse the whole process. Mikra is Teresh B'Ksav, and he's saying it's B'Asiyah. So he said earlier on page 411, exactly, because the fulfillment of Mikra is Dafkin Asiyah. So the fact that Talmud's Bria is interesting point that we have to understand. But the main thing is that the Kavanah is implemented in Asiyah. He said that before on that page. He said, I remember, so the Kavanah of the Mikra is Dafka to come down in Asiyah. So does he mean that the Kvedi Bereishis like that? Probably. Let's read inside. Let's see where he goes. Talmud Bavli. You have placed me, you have seated me in darkness. What is that referring to? Talmud Bavli, because Talmud Bavli is dealing with the darkness of questions and lack of clarity and confusion, and then you're finding clarity in that darkness. Teresh B'Ksav, and even Talmud Yerushalmi is called There's no machshakim. Shahu hapilpul. This is the pilpul, which is the exchange, the conversation, the dialogue, the arguments. Pilpul, all the pilpul that we have in Teresh Peh. Because if you enter into Gemara, what do you see? They come up with a question, and then they start discussing it. And this one says no, and then someone argues, says no. This one brings a verse. This one brings a different verse. Then they bring different statements from their teachers. And then someone says, well, my teacher said a different time, he said something else. It's a whole bunch of arguments and counter arguments. So Chassidus explains that why is it called, the Gemara says, why is it called Machshakim Eshivani? Talmud Bavli. Because Talmud Bavli is exactly, that's its process. Its process is Birur Metecha Cheshech. Talmud Yerushalmi, in some places, it says, is Yosher. There, the ideas are not as quietly debated. There you get more the clarity right away. It tells you this is the halacha. There may be some discussion, but very minimal. Teresh B'Ksav is even more so. Teresh B'Ksav B'Klal, there's no two opinions. Teresh B'Ksav just tells you the facts as they are. So that's the ultimate Yosher. But Talmud Bavli is the process of Machshakim Eshivani, because the pilpul shemahapach cheshach le'er dafke, and that's the ultimate kavanah. That's what the Eibishter wants. He wants us to come into a world of cheshach, where first of all we don't know we don't have clarity. Like I mentioned before, someone says this matzah kosher for Pesach. Is this food kosher? Just using Pesach, but you can use any halacha. So this is all, we're entering into a world where we don't have clarity. It's a dark world because we don't have a light, a Torah that's shining yet, that's telling us what to do. So the Torah of Torah Shebiksav is like Yashar. But if you want to immerse yourself in the very workings of the material world and all its details, that's Torah Shebal Peh. That's the pilpul. That's transforming darkness to light, to come away with a working document, with a working Torah, that you can now say, this is clear, this is what you have to do, and this is what you don't do, and this all the details and the nuances and so on. Kahakor bitsur, like when you strike a flintstone. So we know there's a coal, a hot coal has a flame in it, but then you don't have to strike it, you just have to blow on it, or fan it. But akor bitsur means you have to strike a flintstone to get the spark out of there. The striking means exertion. That's compared to Torah Shebal Peh of Talmud, Machshakim. You go into the darkness, a place where you don't see light. How do you get the spark out of there? You have to strike it. Striking here is called Yegiya Samayach. You struggle, you exert yourself. It's like when you have clarity, you have clarity. What happens when you don't have clarity? We all know we have to break our heads. I'm using that word very specifically, very deliberately. What means break our heads? We have to push ourselves. We have to break through, literally compared to the striking of a flintstone. This is an example used in Chassidus a number of places. So akor bitsur is the striking of the so-called stone, which in this case is the exertion of going through confusion, contradictions, back and forth, or also it includes even the arguments. You have two people come to you and one person says, my partner here owes me $1 million. And he says, no, I don't. So you're in darkness. How do you know who's right? So the Torah process comes and creates clarity. You ask the right questions, you bring witnesses, you have to bring evidence. Torah has a whole process of how you find clarity in a dark world. And that's all the process of Torah Shebal Peh. Machshakim Eshivani. So all that darkness, to get out of that is like hakor bitsur. You have to struggle. It's exertion, like striking the stone. Ukamayim chayim shenishbel liyama kadmeni. So he's citing here verses that talk about hakor bitsur. And when you do that, like when Moshe struck the stone, and then the water flowed out of it. So the Mefarshim, they all talk about that same idea. We're not getting into now whether he was supposed to strike it or speak to it, but the first time he did strike it. Hashem told him to strike it. So that was bringing out deeper resources. When you have to bring out resources that are not so deep, you don't have to strike something. You could just open up a channel and you draw water out of there. But if you have to get water out from a deeper place, like we know, you have to drill, like oil or other natural resources. You can't just dig a little. You have to drill and you have to break through impediments, and then it comes gushing forth. So the psukim talk about it, kamayim chaim, like living water, shanish beliyama kadmeni. That's a pasuk. Let's see today, hakor bitsur. They don't zeichen it, but there's a pasuk. I forgot the full pasuk, but it's hakor bitsur, and that the water then comes flowing from the Yam HaKadmeni, the primordial sea, the Chochmei Law, because Chochmei Law is called Yam HaKadmeni, and then when you draw from there, through this exertion of Torah Shebal Peh, that's why you see when you learn Torah Shebal Peh that the Torah Shebiksav comes alive. Many psukim, which remain cryptic or remain even vague and you don't even see its depth, you suddenly see how a pasuk comes alive. When you ever learn a Gemara on a pasuk, how they dissect the verse, you suddenly say, wow, how did they derive this idea from this verse, which is Torah Shebal Peh? You suddenly see the depth of it. So you're drawing out these deeper waters by striking the stone through the struggling and trying to figure out what the verse means. What Torah Shebiksav means, you're drawing out even the deeper wisdom, like he said earlier, that he spoke about the Ma'im Amukes that comes from Minei Cheshach, that Torah draws out from the depths. The depths. Yeah, the Chachma. Va'af Asisiv. Now he's going back to the posuk. Va'af asisiv. When you say the last step is asisiv, zehu mikra de Torah shebiksav shu ba'asiyah. Which we need to understand. How does that suddenly fit in here? Asisiv seems here would seem much more to be Torah Shebal Peh, Talmud. And here he said Talmud is Bria and Mikra is Asiyah. So let's read and see how he explains it. And then I'll try to explain it if it's not clear. This is also negated to an Ayin Beis. He asked that question. That on one hand, we learn that Talmud is Bria and Mishnah is Yitzira and Mikra is Asiyah. But then it says elsewhere that Mikra is Chabad and Mishnah is Chagas and Talmud is Nehi, where it seems to reverse. So there he explained, because the highest goes down to the lowest levels, if you recall Ayin Beis. I think he's saying somewhat the same thing here, which maybe that just connects it to the Ayin Beis. So let's see what he says. For my honor, Barasiv, I created Adam de Bria, which is the man of Bria, which means the structure of Bria. The Talmud, with Talmud, Shein midig daily himenu. The Gemara says about Gemara in Talmud that there's no measure greater than Talmud, is even greater than other parts of Torah. We learned this in Ayin Beis as well, in Baba Metzia, I believe. Yeah, Lamed Gimel Aleph. Let's see what he says here. Why? Because Birur the Chezer, Shemischadish bepilpul ein shir, ein midah. So Talmud is compared to a place that has no measure, because it's referring to the Birur, the clarity that we get from the refractive light, the Chezer, that comes from pilpul, which is it reveals like an infinite element of Torah, because when you dig like that and you drill and you go through all that exertion, you get new resources that are unlimited resources. That's Talmud. This is, however, this is specifically through Chezer, from the effort from below. Shamalchus. That Malchus bechinas keser kitzmicha she'ela momato lamayla. I think he's saying Shamalchus elevates to the level of keser, like a tzmicha, like something growing that grows from the bottom up. Like when you plant a seed in the ground, then whatever the vegetation, the grass, whatever it may be, grows from the bottom up. That's Chezer. Aval bebirur de Yasha de chachmei law milmayla mato canal. But the clarity that comes from Yashar, from the top down, Torah shebiksav mikra, kameshikasav lechvedi barasav zeu Torah shebiksav. Like it says, lechvedi barasav. So I'm not sure why he's saying it again, lechvedi barasav. Lecheda, he really means asisiv. He says that's the written Torah. Va'af asisiv b'mishnah v'talmud, shabol l'maisa b'peil mamish. And then the af asisiv is referring to the Mishnah and Talmud, which brings it down l'maisa in action, an actionable document, like I said, a working document. Kitzir evarim chitzenim, like the tzir, like the shape and form of the outer limbs, the child that's developed. Shenikra Adam Asiyah. Now you're talking already Adam Asiyah, not Adam Bria. Va'af, when you say va'af asisiv, what is the af? And also Asiyah l'beisa. It comes to add something. Mishum de noz tchilas b'seifen dafke kanal. Because the beginning is wedged in the end. So the af is emphasizing an addition that's happening dafke in Asiyah. Now, trust me, kanal v'dal. Trust me, I'm as confused as you are. I'm not clear here. Well, first he began Asiyah is mikra. Now he's saying Asiyah is Mishnah and Talmud in the Chezer. So I think I have to read this again. It seems to me that's connected to the Chezer or the Yasha, depending which direction you're going. In other words, mikra and Asiyah is mitzad Yasha. But if you're talking about Chezer, it's an Asiyah that everything gets elevated to a higher level. That's what it sounds like to me. But the language is a little not so clear to me. If someone hasn't figured out, by all means, I would need to read this a few more times, because I don't really understand. I understand the content, but I don't understand how the words add up to the content, so to speak. So in other words, what he's saying here is clear, that there's the element of the Yasha that comes down from the top down, and it's an Chezer where it's all fulfilled, because the darkness is transformed to light. That's clear. And Malchus ends up higher than, all the way up to Keser. But how he fits it into the pasuk, L'kfeidi, Aparosiv, Yisativ, Afasisiv, not so clear to me, to be very honest. And I need to read it again. I don't know if now is the time. I'll read it. We have the next 2 days. There's not going to be a class. I'll check it out a little more. But if somebody wants to comment on it, by all means. But I'm saying to you right now, I don't have it clear yet, which is fine. That's part of the, like he says here, it begins not being clear, but I'm going to exert myself to try to figure it out. Right now, it's not very clear to me the exact meaning of all the different sentences here. So I'm going to stop here regardless, but if anybody wants to comment or ask or explain, if anyone has an explanation of how this works, by all means, we're all partners in this.
I can't explain it, but I had a question just in the preceding sentence. Why does he end it with Le'ain Shir? He's talking about what you just said, this whole dissection and clear in Birur, like through the pilpul. He says Le'ain Shir, like with I mean, without any like. Go ahead.
Yeah, because that's the in Torah Shebiksav. There's because of its Mamay Lamata, it's very defined. That many letters, words, and you don't add to that. Torah Shebal Peh is what's called La Fashaba. And Torah he also talks about it in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, that it's endless. Because once you start digging deeper, the pilpul part opens up.
Keeps going.
Yeah, like we see. You can learn Gemara, and even if with all the commentaries, you could always add to it. Because once you start digging deep, it's like endless resources deep under the ground.
I see.
And it's based on the Gemara that he brings. You see, he brings the Gemara Ein Bei Midah. Actually, I should refer you, because in Ayim Beis, he brings that same Gemara, and I want to look it up, because I think it's connected. I think it's connected to the whole piece. Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh. Oh, okay. Never a dull moment, right?
No, this is a lot of analysis and interpretation. Today's learning.
Right.
Took a lot out of you.
Oh, it's fine. We'll figure it out. I'm confident we'll get through it. It just
Well, it's interesting. As expansive as the Mittler Rebbe usually is, he leaves these little tidbits that are still open to more analysis.
Yeah. I'm looking where the modern Bereishis in Bab Mitzia. I remember struggling with it there too. 1 second. I don't find it now. Okay.
I don't know if you can listen while you're looking, but I wonder if it's also the Ein Shir, because we're constantly applying even what is in the Torah, Shebel Peh, and the Gemara to modern, increasingly developed, evolving circumstances here in our lives, like to medicine or technology and new inventions that you never had to think, how does the halacha apply to it? But as they come into being, let's say use of stem cells or in vitro fertilization, but new technologies.
That's fine. That's good. That works. Yeah. I found it on page 1380 in Ayim Beis. It talks about it very explicitly. Yeah, I definitely connected to what we're learning here, because he talks all about Machshakim Shivani, Torah Shebiksav, Torah Shebal Peh.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so 1380. I'm going to stop here. So we're stopping here at the end of the paragraph, page on 415.